Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 23 playthrough of the Colorado Rockies. We are at the beginning of 2053. We've done our big work for this off season at this point. The big move that we made was bringing on center fielder Eddie Farley from the Boston Red Sox. Excellent defensive center fielder, pretty good bat. You can see he's averaged over 30 homers and close to 100 RBIs over the last few years. And over the course of his career, he's led the American League in homers a couple times, slugging percentage a couple of times, WAR a couple of times, and has been a pretty effective offensive and defensive player with a number of Silver Slugger awards, a Gold Glove, lots of All-Star appearances, and a couple of AL MVP awards. So that has been our big acquisition. We've also made an offer to starting pitcher Manny Orozco. We've offered him a minor league deal with a major league option. Think that he could potentially help the back end of our bullpen. And then other than that, the other two interesting players that we brought on board are another player who's a center fielder, similar to Eddie Farley in the fact that he's a center fielder, and similar to Orozco in the fact that we've got him signed to a minor league deal with major league options. And that player is the center fielder Hector Rivera, come out of Mexico this year as a international free agent. I think that with his glove and his speed, he could be a pretty interesting player to have on the roster, even though his bat does not appear quite major league ready. And then the last acquisition we made is Edgar Estrada, if I could think properly here, second baseman who we picked up on the Rule 5 from Pittsburgh. Questionable whether this Double-A player will make the leap to the major leagues for us this year, but we're willing to give him a chance in a look in spring training. Similarly, in the Rule 5 draft, we also picked up DJ Cortez, a pitcher who could help us out as a right-hander out of the bullpen. So that's kind of the new additions this off season. We've still got about $12 million to potentially spend. The guy that we're most interested in is Mario Lafroja, a 31-year-old who's fragile. I think he could be a really interesting right-handed arm out of our bullpen. He wants to be a starter, and he's looking for $8.5 million, and he's coming off of a relatively serious torn flexor tendon. So we're getting an updated scouting report on him. If someone else gives him that kind of money over the next couple weeks before we get the scouting report, good luck to them. But we will hopefully get that scouting report by mid-January and potentially consider bringing him on board depending on how that looks, how much money he's ultimately willing to sign for, and whether or not he wants to be guaranteed a spot in the starting rotation. So that's kind of the plan for the rest of the offseason. Obviously, plans can change. We'll see where things go over the next few weeks with who's available on the free agent market and what our team looks like. And after that, we will get into the preseason and spring training and try to figure out the 26 players who will be on our roster as we break camp and head north to Colorado and attempt to defend our World Series title that we earned last season. And unfortunately, Manny Orozco signed with Atlanta. A little surprising. I thought we had offered him $2 million if he were to make the major league team. He signed with them for a little less than $1.5 million. Maybe he thought his chances of making the major league team were better with the Braves than they were with our Rockies. But still disappointing that we won't get him back. Fortunately, we do have the scouting report on Mario Lafroja. And even coming off that injury, he looks like someone who could potentially help us, particularly in the bullpen. It says his contract demand is $11 million at this point. So maybe the fact that he does seem to be somewhat healthy coming off of that injury has him feeling like he should get paid a ton of money. I don't see him as an $11 million pitcher with his fragility and his age. I think he could definitely be a very useful bullpen arm for us. Clearly, he wants to be a starter. I don't think we can promise him that type of role. The guy hasn't pitched. I mean, he's missed an entire season at this point. Hasn't pitched since 2051. He is a one-time All-Star. He has a decent career resume. Pretty much an average major league starter, though, in terms of his ERA and his FIP minus. Average in terms of his record, also at 77 and 76 for his career, and he's never really worked out of the bullpen, and I don't think he wants to. So if the price comes down in the coming weeks, we would consider bringing him on board. If not, I don't love the options that are out there in the free agent market at this point, particularly given their prices. I do like Lafrosia, and I do like Arabamge, but not at the dollar amounts that they're looking for at this point. In some unfortunate news for our pitching staff, Chase Crawford, who could have potentially been our closer this coming season, going to be out for 6 months with a torn labrum that he suffered while racing his teammate on the highway. Torn labrum in the shoulder seems like a odd injury to occur while racing your teammate on the highway in a car accident, but I guess it's possible. So that's going to set us back a little bit further, and certainly make us more eager to potentially attempt to overpay for one of these pitchers that's still available. But since I don't love any of them and they're looking for pretty big money, I think the other option right now is for me to do a little bit of searching. I don't think the trade block's going to have anyone all that exciting to us, although there's actually people on it now. So I can spend a little time on the trade block, but then I think more just searching for players in general may yield some prospects that perhaps we could try to trade for to bolster our bullpen, which definitely needs at least one more right-handed arm at this point, with the departures of Ricky Rios and Ethan Mingo through free agency, and now the fact that we're going to be without Chase Crawford probably till about the All-Star break, and who knows what he's going to be like when he's coming back from that injury. So feel like we could definitely use some right-handed help in the bullpen at this point. And this would have been nice information to have earlier, but Jose Williams just raised our team budget from $316 million to $330 million. Obviously, if we had known that we were going to have that kind of money in the off season, could have definitely done things a little bit differently. But certainly does open up the opportunity for us to get a little more aggressive with Arabamge or Lafrosia, both of whom's demands have come down a bit. We could definitely look to add both of those arms at this point, particularly if they're shorter deals, given that both of those players are fragile and in their 30s. Don't know that I want to make a long-term commitment, but think that they are both players who could absolutely help us this coming season, particularly working out of the bullpen and maybe as an occasional spot starter if we have some injuries. So we're trying to defend a title, so if we've got money to spend, we are going to spend it. And Lafrosia's looking for just a one-year deal at $8.5 million. He wants to be guaranteed a spot in the starting rotation. We are not going to guarantee him that. We will give him a bonus if he pitches 160 innings, because we're not intending that he's going to pitch that often. But we're also going to see if he'll be willing to sign for $7 million rather than the $8.5 million that he's looking for. And he really wants to be a member of the rotation. We'll give you $7.5 million, but we're not going to guarantee you a spot in the rotation. But we'll up the bonus if you get to 160 innings, because we're certainly not intending on allowing you to pitch that often. No, he's set on being part of the rotation, so chance that he may come back to us at some point if he doesn't get another deal. But at this point, I think we may move on to Adebamge. Again, he's going to be someone who wants to be in the rotation, and I don't know that we want to guarantee him that. Doesn't necessarily have the perfect movement that we'd prefer to see for a pitcher in Colorado. But he still is a ground baller with ground ball tendencies. He's looking for a 5-year deal at $12.76 million a year with a guarantee of being in the starting rotation. He's going to be pretty disappointed when we offer him. We'll offer him 2 years, but the second year is going to be a team option. Actually, we'll offer him 3 years. That'll make him feel like he's perhaps closer to what he's looking for. And I don't really love the money that we're going to spend on this guy, given that he's aging and fragile. But we've got money to spend, and we are trying to defend a title. So we're going to spend it. So he's looking $12.7 million for 5 years. We're offering him an average of $12 million for 3 years, with the last 2 really being team options. And we're not guaranteeing him the spot in the starting rotation that he wants. Now, he really wants to be the starting rotation. He'll take less money. We're not going to guarantee you a spot in the starting rotation. We'll give you a 2-year deal with a team option for the final season. And we'll actually give you the higher amount of money that you're looking for to put it at a $12.4 million average. And he's willing to think about it. So maybe Oz Adebamge will be the addition to our bullpen for this offseason. Had been searching the just a general player search, and I can pull it back up here, of pitchers. You can see with above average stuff, really good movement and average control, and there's, a couple dozen players who meet that profile out there. You can see we've got a lot of them already on the Rockies, given that that's the profile we're looking for. But in terms of the cost of those players in trade, there wasn't really anything compelling. So the fact that we now have this additional money to just go spend in the free agent market is actually a very positive development, as we try to add a couple of pitchers to help our bullpen out and potentially give us some additional insurance in the event of injuries to our starting rotation. And we did get Adebamge signed, so that is a positive development for our pitching staff. As I said, my goal is to have him be a extremely expensive reliever for us at this point, but he is a player who looks like he can also potentially start with a 4-pitch arsenal of major league or better quality pitches, plus that changeup. Certainly could be a starter for us, but given his fragility, we're going to immediately give him an aggressive tiredness hook, and likely we'll be working him out of the bullpen initially. Obviously, the usage of these players will change as we get closer to the season, but just not changing our rotation, but seeing where Hartman would slot him in the bullpen. And yeah, he would put Adebamge right into that closer role, which could be an interesting use for him. Crawford, who's now hurt, and Vargas are our other options. So would assume at this point that it'll be Adebamge or Vargas as our closer when the season actually does begin. And we still have about $17 million to spend with that most recent boost to our budget. Got a lot of money in scouting and development already. Have enough money in international amateur free agent. Have enough money in the draft budget. Don't mind going into the season with a little bit of money in the piggy bank, so to speak, which will give us a lot of flexibility if we decide to make some trades as we get closer to the trade deadline to fill some needs on the team. That being said, still would be happy to improve the roster, particularly with maybe one more right-handed pitcher as we get closer to the beginning of spring training. And we're closing in on the start of spring training. Still have tons of money to spend. I just don't feel like there's anyone all that compelling in the free agent market at this point, or in the obvious players that we could potentially trade for. If Lafrosia circles back with us and is more reasonable in his demands, he definitely remains an option. Otherwise, I don't think it's the end of the world if we go into this season with maybe the 11th and or 12th pitcher on our pitching staff being someone who's kind of a marginal player. I don't think we have to have the 26-man roster perfected, and certainly as teams fall out of contention, particularly with relief pitchers, there should be some pretty interesting options available in trade as we get into June and July. So I don't think I'm going to press anything here on February 17th. Again, if Lafrosia revisits things with us and he's willing to not be a starter, I would happily bring him on board. But I want to do it under our terms. And we're going to go to camp with 50 players this year, which is a big number for us. I don't know that we have a ton of roster decisions to make. It's really those last 3 or 4 spots on the roster, the last couple of pitchers, and then the last couple of backup position players. We're going to go with our traditional 6-man rotation in the preseason. And Arabamge, who could end up being our closer, but we're going to give him a shot in the rotation because our manager wants to use him as the number 4 starter ahead of both Javi Toledo and Jose Ortega. So we'll at least give him a chance to see what we've got with Arabamge here in the preseason and spring training. That'll allow Vargas to be our closer over the near term and obviously have tons of depth in our pitching staff with 21 pitchers in camp. And we've got 28 position players in camp, too. So going to try to give as many people playing time in the preseason as is possible during spring training. I think that Adam Fields and Alex Alvarez are the only players who are going to be in our lineups against both righties and lefties regularly. Other than that, we're just trying to give a lot of players playing time so we can hopefully make the right decision with the back end of the roster when we do get to the end of spring training and have to make those decisions. And we've made it to the end of spring training, relatively healthy. Crawford obviously is still on the injured list. Ramon Lopez, who is a marginal prospect to make the team, likely will begin in AAA. He's got some mild shoulder inflammation. The one thing that did come up in spring training, Jordan Casares, our shortstop, suffered a broken foot and is now fragile in terms of his injury proneness. Feel like we have competent backups on the roster to him at shortstop, most notably Rogelio Terrazas. But the range that Terrazas has is certainly not optimal for a shortstop. And I think that you could pretty fairly say the same thing about Danny Ruiz, since his range is also the same. So if we do have some injury issues with Casares over the course of the season, locating a shortstop who's better than either Terrazas or Ruiz defensively may be something that we need to look into. We did have Dave Baena, who was a minor league free agent signing of ours a little over a year ago, spent all of last year in AAA with us. Did have him in camp, but he's really not much better defensively than either of those other 2 guys, and certainly doesn't have a major league bat at this point in his career, almost 32 years old. So just something that we're going to need to keep on the radar as we get into the season. You can see we've still got 48 players in camp here as we get about finished with spring training. The team went 16-8, so one of the better records in baseball, not surprisingly. And now it's just a matter of cutting that 48 men roster that we still have in spring training at this point almost in half to the 26 players that we're going to break camp with and head to Colorado with. And for our pitching staff, hasn't been too hard to get down to 13 players with the injury to Chase Crawford. The final spot on the roster is going to come down to DJ Cortez. You may remember we picked him up in the Rule 5 draft from the Mets. I think he could be a respectable back end of the rotation, back end of the bullpen arm for us. Good movement on his pitches, ground ball tendencies, ground ball or pitcher type. Pretty good personality. It's either going to be the veteran, the 34-year-old Cortez, or the youngster Javon Williams, who's a guy who's come up through our system after being an 8th-round pick in 2049. Spent the last couple years in Albuquerque, closed for us part of the time. He's certainly ready for the majors at this point. The thing that I don't love about him is that he is not a ground ball tendency type of pitcher, and the movement on his pitches isn't that great. So I think we are going to go with Cortez for the time being. Williams also still has 3 option years left. So unfortunately for Mr. Williams, the fact that he has those neutral tendencies rather than the ground ball tendencies that everyone else on the staff has, and he has the lowest movement on his pitches of anyone, materially lower than Cortez, is going to mean that Williams is, for the 3rd straight season, going to be starting the year off in AAA. So we've got down to the 12 pitchers we're going to take north with us, and you can see they all still have 50 or higher stamina, so that's part of the reason we feel like we can get away with only 12. Got to figure out what to do with the rotation. Loera, obviously, in the rotation. Alvarado and Vasquez, even though they didn't have the best springs, not going to move them out. But the back end of the rotation, Arabamge, who we had brought on to potentially be a closer, has pitched really well, 2-2 record, but a 2.65 ERA. But Javi Toledo and Jose Ortega also did not pitch badly. Given that Arabamge is the new addition to the team, and he's also fragile in terms of his injury proneness, we're going to move him back to the bullpen, move back to the 5-man rotation that we had kind of intended. And unfortunately, I will adjust this again, put Arabamge back in there, Ortega up to the 4th spot, Javi Toledo in at the 5th hole. Loera is going to be our first starter. I don't know what our manager was thinking there. So Loera, Alvarado, Vasquez, Ortega, and Toledo, the same 5-man rotation we finished up last year with, is going to be the 5 men in the rotation this year. Looking at the bullpen, it looks like he wants to give the opportunity to Arabamge. The fragility could go either way. I don't love the fact that as a reliever he could be pitching multiple games in a row. But we can probably modify that a bit by making sure that when he's fatigued, we don't pitch him. But if he's starting every day, then he's going to be going 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 plus pitches potentially, which also isn't the best thing. So we're going to at least see what he can do to start off the year as our closer. Vargas, secondary role of closer, makes sense to us. And then both of those 2 players, along with Will Lucio, would probably be the first 3 in the mix if we do have any injuries in our starting rotation as to who would get the opportunity. We'll see how these guys all do in the bullpen. It could be an embarrassment of riches here again with the pitching. You can see pretty much everyone in the bullpen, at least in terms of their ERA, has had a pretty sound spring training. So feeling pretty good that this pitching staff will still be very effective this year, even though we are pitching half our games in Colorado. And the first real difficult decision comes down to our backup catchers. You may remember Chris Rodriguez was our backup last year, hit 205 in 132 at-bats. Above average in terms of his ability, pretty average arm, pretty mediocre hitter, normal in terms of his injury proneness. He's 32 years old. Picked up Jose Ramirez as a minor league free agent signing this offseason, just less than 2 months ago. He's a pretty similar batting profile, honestly, pretty similar defensive profile. Might have a little bit better of an arm, has a good personality also. Hit just a .185 with the Cubs last year. He is durable. He does have 2 option years left. I think there's an argument to be made that Ramirez is slightly better than Rodriguez. But because we can send Ramirez down to AAA Albuquerque, that's going to allow Rodriguez to maintain his very tenuous hold on that backup catcher job for us. That takes us down to 18 players, so still have 4 more cuts to go before we can get to our 26-man roster of 12 pitchers and 14 position players. And this next cut is just going to honestly come down to relationships. Everyone on the major league team, with the exception of left fielder Bobby Mata, who was our Rule 5 pick a year ago, has pretty good relationships with our manager, Nick Mata. Our manager, Nick Hartman. Bobby Mata is the guy that doesn't have a good relationship with him, and he's kind of a marginal guy to make the roster anyways. And he's also a player who could potentially benefit from a little AAA seasoning, since we had to jump him from A-ball all the way to the majors last year. So the fact that Mott is not completely developed and also doesn't get along that well with our manager is going to result in him beginning the season in the minor leagues. And you may remember in our last episode that Hector Rivera, the young center field international free agent out of Mexico, was a guy that we signed to a minor league contract with a major league option. He does have the option 30 days from now to opt out of his contract, but because he still definitely has some development to do as far as his contact and then all of the other areas as well, and he's not going to be getting regular time in the majors for us. So we are going to send him down to AAA also and ensure that he gets as much playing time as possible over the next 4 weeks before we potentially have to make a decision as to whether we want to keep him in the organization by bringing him up to the majors. And obviously there's a chance that he won't opt out of that contract. But we do have 30 days to figure things out with him, and would rather have him be getting a little more, or actually a lot more, playing time in AAA than he would be getting in the majors, to see what we either have or don't have with him at this point. Which leaves us with 4 players at this point for 3 spots. The players on the bubble are a couple of infielders and a couple of outfielders. Edgar Estrada, who was a Rule 5 pick for us last year, guy who had made it to Double-A in the Pittsburgh organization. Kind of like his bat, like his defensive versatility, although he's not particularly good anywhere defensively. He is a guy who is at least competent at playing a few positions that we can put out there in a pinch if we need to. Really most attracted by his bat, though. Definitely looks like a player who has potential to have an above-average bat as an infielder, which always isn't the easiest thing in the world to find. The issue, of course, is that he's not really an infielder with those ratings, and he'd be much better off as a outfielder or perhaps a first baseman, being 6'2". But I do like his bat, so he is in the mix. Jose Brito, a former Rule 5 pick from 2048, our first year with the team when we took over after the 2048 season. Another utility player, pretty similar defensively, quite honestly. He's fragile physically. He's 30 years old at this point, and he's out of arbitration years. Doesn't have quite the bat that I think we could potentially have from Mr. Estrada, but I think that he's a little more proven as a major leaguer at this point and definitely has the better power rating. So those two guys are in the mix to make the team as utility players. And then the other two players, one of whom will be cut among these four, Manlio Milinhos. See a common theme here, a Rule 5 player from 2049. Spent all of last year up with us as a fourth or fifth outfielder. Good personality, got some speed, pretty decent contact hitter, although he hit just 269 last year. Not a ton of power, but a useful player. He does have option years left, which could work against him when we get to decision-making time. And last but not least is Angel Gomez. He was a minor league free agent signing of ours before last season, Christmas 2051, when we picked him up. Moved him pretty quickly through the minors. He was a somewhat established player, although still only 22 years old when we picked him up. But he moved through our system pretty quickly, got up to AAA last year, and actually did play 4 games at the majors, going 1 for 9 for us. Pretty versatile defensive outfielder, doesn't have a great arm, but can definitely play left or center. And he can also play a mediocre infield for us, given that he doesn't have the best arm in the world, but he has acceptable range, at least at second base, and a decent bat, and he's also durable. He, too, has 2 option years left, which will factor into our decision-making, but Milinhos, Gomez, Brito, and Estrada are the 4 guys who are on the bubble when we try to get this team down to 14 players. And we've decided that Jose Brito is going to be the odd man out. He doesn't have option years, unlike Gomez and Milinhos, but felt like both of those guys are younger players and potentially more interesting bats. And the fact that Edgar Estrada's bat is really interesting to us, and we would have to keep him up to maintain possession of him in our organization, was ultimately the deciding factor for us. Although Brito's out of options, I think there's a chance that we'll be able to get him down to AAA with nobody picking up his contract. And quite honestly, if someone does pick him up, not going to be the end of the world. So we're going to waive and DFA Mr. Jose Brito. And we have our 26-man roster that we're going to head into the 2053 season with. So as we look at our pitching staff, feel like we've got a really nice mix of left-handed and right-handed pitchers in both the rotation and the bullpen. We've already talked about the rotation, the same 5 we had last year. The big story of the beginning of the season, and hopefully by the All-Star break we'll have this resolved, is Rogelio Loera and his quest for 300 victories. He is 10 wins away at this point, after leading the NL with 18 wins last year and earning his 11th Cy Young Award. So Loera is going to be chasing 300 wins for us when the season begins. We've already talked about Arabamgue and Vargas as potential closers, Darius McLeod back in a setup role, and then we've got a nice combination here of a lefty and righty in middle relief roles with Fields and Cortez, and lefties and righties in long relief roles with Latrell Young and Will Lucio. So we may adjust some of what our manager wants to do here on the margin, but hoping, as I said earlier, for another very effective year from this pitching staff here in the 2053 season. And looking at least what our manager intends to do with our starting lineups, it's pretty simple because it's the exact same starting lineup, whether it's going up against lefties or righties. We may change some of that on the margin, try to give some of the younger players, particularly those who have right-handed bats, a little bit of action in the lineup against left-handed pitchers. But the lineup is pretty straightforward. Bobby Perez, former Rookie of the Year, batting first in right field. Eddie Farley, the new addition, big free agent acquisition from the offseason, is going to be our center fielder. Adam Fields, World Series MVP last year, the designated hitter. Robbie Carrillo finished second in the MVP voting last year. He's our cleanup hitter and left fielder. Carrillo won the batting title last year. Elijah Moore, who hits fifth, was the runner-up in the MVP voting last year, and he'll be playing first base for us. Danny Ruiz moves from center field back into second base for us. Alex Alvarez as our catcher. Alex Ortega at third base. And Jordan Casares will be our shortstop. So a pretty similar lineup to last season. The really only significant change is that Eddie Farley takes over in center field. Danny Ruiz moves to second base. And that means that Rogelio Terrazas moves to the bench. But it is conceivable, given that Jordan Casares is fragile in terms of his injury proneness, and Jordan Casares is also a left-handed hitter who is reasonably inept against left-handed pitching, that we are going to put Terrazas in to play shortstop against right-handed pitchers, just to hopefully at least generate a little more offense from that spot. And then even though Terrazas is not a optimal defensive shortstop, at least give Casares a little bit of planned time off whenever we're facing left-handed pitchers to hopefully help keep him healthy. We may make some other changes to the roster or the lineup on the margins, but you can see the only two lefties that we have in the lineup, in Bobby Perez and Adam Fields, are both pretty young and pretty productive players, so I don't know that we'll be looking to make a platoon move with either of those guys. So as the season gets ready to begin, finding a better backup defensive option at shortstop is something we're thinking about. Potentially adding another pitcher for the bullpen is something we're thinking about. And we've got tons of money in the budget to potentially do it in terms of making a trade as the season moves along. So feeling pretty confident that we'll be able to make some adjustments as this season moves along, if we do need to make any. And the goal, of course, is to repeat as World Series champions. And we will begin that quest in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.